God bless you. To this Tuesday afternoon, we're grateful to be back with another clergy conversation, and I'm happy, I'm excited, and I'm elated today to have one of my preaching heroes, one of my mentors, and one of God's greatest preachers and pastors to be with us on today. And yes, he talked about my Oklahoma State because he already know, but that's all good. But I'm proud and happy to have with us today the proud pastor of the Mount Sinai Missionary Baptist Church of Austin, Texas, Reverend Dr. A.W.A. Mays. Pop Mays, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad and excited to share with you.
I'm grateful to that you came and that you want to talk with us and help us young whippersnappers, as they would call us, and other pastors and preachers out. So I'm grateful for you taking out some time to be with us today. So let's start this off. I just want to ask, tell us a little bit about your background.
Background, going back to the beginning, I was born into a family of my father's passed on, my mother's passed on, two sons to our family. I am born and reared in Taylor, Texas, born in the Dickey Clinic in Taylor, Texas, brought up in Round Rock, Texas, brought up in a Christian family, taken in after the death of our mother by grandparents. Not too long after our mother passed, our grandfather passed. So from the age of 8 years of age, my brother and I were brought up by our grandmother that people hear me talk about. We called her Big Mama, which is a strange thing. But when Mount Sinai knows when I talk about Big Mama, they know I'm talking about my background, how I grew up.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So you said you lost your mom at an early age. How was that experience for you?
Well, in our family situation, our father was in the military, and when mother died, it was a transition, not a great move to be taken in by the grandparents.
Right.
Even though mother was passed and gone, but the trauma that might have been was eased in that we were immediately taken in by grandmother and lived until we became adults in her home.
Yes, sir.
There were some emotional things, but when you are young, 8 years of age, maybe it didn't hit you as much or the feeling as much as it might have been at some other age and stage.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So when you are growing up at your grandmother's house, you're matriculating that way. How was your education? Because a lot of people don't know that Pop Mays actually made history, this like real history, real African American history, real Texas history, as being the first African American student at Round Rock High School. So Pop Mays, talk to us about that.
Well, I'm remembering that we grew up in those years under segregation. There was the all-black school called Hopewell School, small school because Round Rock, small town, didn't have a large school. Thank God for the teachers and the community that supported that work. They did everything that they could to give us a good, solid foundation. I mean, they did not play when it came to getting your schoolwork done. We could sing our multiplication tablets. We had competitions at the chalkboard, boys versus girls on math problems. It was certainly a sound foundation, but being that it was a black school, it lacked some facilities and some opportunities. And in short fashion, in 1964, the summer of 1964, it filtered down to Round Rock about the Civil Rights Act that was passed, and the Round Rock High School, the Round Rock ISD members, the board members, had passed a resolution to offer freedom of choice to students. Students could make a choice as to which school they would go to. I was sharing that news with an older cousin riding in a car, and he made the statement it was a shame that no one was going. And impulsively, really, I didn't think about it. It just came out that I said I was going. Didn't plan to go before that moment, hadn't given a lot of thought to it, but said I'm going. And got into a situation where among our family, it was made known, and I was kind of locked into it from that time on. And as it turned out, I was going from my freshman year to my sophomore year. And so it turned out I was the only one. I had made that decision, was sticking to it. And so in the fall of 1964 in Round Rock, I enrolled in Round Rock High School, and for 2 full years, I was the only African American student in that school's population. In our senior year, beginning our senior year in 1966, the schools were combined and the ending of segregation, and I graduated in 1967 with my former schoolmates and classmates of Hopewell School. But it was an impulsive thing, but I got to say it was God inspired, because I did have some shaky moments where I decided, I almost decided to go back and return to Hopewell. There was some disconnection, but God saw me through, and especially my grandmother, that I cried on her bed one day, that I felt like I was in no man's land. I wasn't really at Hopewell, relating to my former schoolmates and classmates, and I wasn't really in connection with the fellow students at Round Rock High School. But she told me, "You started and you can't go back." And she had that kind of courage, because as a grandmother, she feared sometimes what majority of people could do, but I was safe. I had some good people that took care of me while I was going there.
So when you were talking about being alone, 'cause I think that's something that a lot of people deal with, especially when they're going somewhere where it's new, or they're going somewhere where they're unfamiliar with. And some people just in high school in general, or just in as we look at life, dealing with that feeling of loneliness, dealing with that feeling of kind of being by yourself. What are some things besides, praying grandmother, besides that advice? What are things that you did personally to persevere, even though you felt those moments and those times of just being lonely?
Well, I had a feeling within myself. Later on, I've grown up to feel that it wasn't a fair burden, but I felt like I was representative. I felt like Black students were going to be judged according to what my story was, how I behaved myself, and trying to, I guess you'd say, earn acceptance by being good and not getting into any trouble. So I had gone to Round Rock High School, actually enrolled, determined that what I was going to do was going to be the best student that I could be. And as it turned out, the coach of the high school, um, Coach Nelson, he's passed on now, met me in the hallway after I'd been there for a few days and literally told me I was coming out for football. I hadn't thought to go out for athletics, but he told me I was coming, and so my schedule was rearranged, and became a part of the football team. And long story short, we had some success. And sometimes sports can open a door and make some connections that otherwise you wouldn't have. And so from the football season and running track, um, in some ways opened some doors and made me to feel a little less lonely, although there was some caution, even in Round Rock, about how far maybe I might cross over the line socially. But I didn't have any desire to cross over socially. I was dedicated to the idea that I was going to represent and represent well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you said that, not representing well, did you feel any added pressure, as you said, being the only African American? Did you feel the pressure of representing your race or representing the culture? Did you ever feel any kind of pressure?
Yes, God blessed me when it comes to the classroom and books. Favored me in that I actually had the challenge that in order to prepare to go to the University of Texas Hook'em Horns, uh, that my first year of high school at Hopewell, some of what I should have had in order to prepare for the university, I couldn't qualify for, except I would double up on some things. And so I had to double up on math requirements and had to actually go to summer school one summer in Austin High School to take a language requirement, so that at that time you had to have 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 2 years of a foreign language. And in order to meet that requirement, I had to double up. But actually, um, I was an unknown in the sense that I remember, shortly after being there, taking, a test. I don't know whether it was a midterm test or pop quiz, but I do remember the coach, the assistant coach, one of the assistant coaches who was um, teaching the class, celebrated my test score. I had made a 95 on the test, and he actually was announcing, they nicknamed me Tony. He said, Tony made a 95. And then after I gave him some thought about it, I said what he was actually acting as though he was shocked that I could pass a test to that level. So they weren't used to me and I wasn't used to them, but after a while we got used to each other.
Absolutely. So then, after you graduate from Round Rock High School, yes, he said it. Yes, Pop May said he went to UT. We're not going to do any kind of judging here, but that's an inside joke between me and him. But but you went to University of Texas at Austin. At Austin. So talk to us about that experience.
Well, I had an aunt who's passed away, Annabelle Jones Prosser, my mother's sister, and she was a teacher in school, and she had taken some graduate level classes at the University of Texas, and she sowed, I guess, into our lives a fondness for the University of Texas, um, even though the history was really a negative history toward welcoming blacks. But strangely, we would watch the annual Longhorns versus the Aggies Thanksgiving football game.
Which they need to bring back.
Yeah, we would watch that game and be pulling for the Longhorns. But anyway, my choice of going to the University of Texas was influenced uh, by money, by economics, I want to say. It was so inexpensive. Private schools and going away to school, we didn't have money to speak of. And get this shock, when I enrolled in the University of Texas in 1967, the fall of 1967, tuition for a semester was $50.
I'm sorry, what?
$50, 50, for tuition. It, is a state-supported school, and people can't believe that it was that inexpensive. And so, having a a score on the SAT that qualified me for that, and the rank of my graduation in the top 10% of my class, it just was convenient, and money-wise, it was very inexpensive. Of course, they began to change that while I was there to begin to make it more expensive, but the tuition could only be changed by the state legislature, and so it remained very inexpensive for the beginning years at UT. And so it wasn't a hard decision for me to make, to go to become a Longhorn amongst 50,000 other students there in Austin.
Well, for $50, I can't blame you for $50. I wish tuition was $50.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Bring it back. Bring it back. Local, predominantly Black university now in school that my brother attended. Tuition was like $600, maybe $700. It was just way up as far as the cost and expense. But UT was very inexpensive. Now that $50 didn't include books and things of that nature and several fees, but you can understand a lot of it was economics.
Right, absolutely. And I know you majored in English, correct?
I went to the University of Texas. I had not surrendered to my ministry. I had not accepted my call. I was a freshman, and my intention, and actually my beginning major was math. I was good in math in school and intended to pursue math. But in my sophomore year, I felt that after I had surrendered to my ministry, I didn't see math as supportive to my ministry as I would be helpful to become a better preacher. And moving around, I discovered that English was my almost equal in strength. And so I graduated majoring in English because I felt that of all that UT offered, it might help me with communication.
Absolutely. So, talk to us then about when you received the call from God to go into the gospel ministry.
I was a member of a small church in Round Rock, my home church, called Sweet Home Baptist Church, and grew up in a traditional manner, involved in youth activities as a youngster, choir and ushering and everything else that was asked of youth and children. But at the age of 12, I had the experience of knowing that God was calling me into the gospel ministry, that I was to preach. And some of those experiences at worship, that'd be a transforming, that it wouldn't be the preacher that was standing there. It was like I had an out-of-body spirit experience, and I was watching myself stand in the pulpit being the preacher. Suddenly I could see it, I could know it. But our family at that time didn't have any close relationship with any preacher. So I only knew preachers from a distance. And I felt that it wasn't really a life that you could expect to have any joy. And so I tried to bargain with God and say, Lord, if you let me live a little bit, have some fun, be a genuine person, then I'll surrender to my call. And so I kept putting it away from me. Although it was there, I finally, in my sophomore year at the University of Texas, when I was 19, God said it's time and would not continue to allow me to postpone or to put off. And so from the age of 12, I had this God consciousness that I felt that preachers didn't do this and preachers couldn't do that. And I wanted to live and live a normal life. But at age 19, it was such an experience that I felt like the old style where cars would get in a mud hole.
Yes, sir.
And I was experienced with, sometimes cars getting into a soft spot and the inexperienced driver uh, gunning his accelerator, spinning his wheels instead of getting out of the hole, was actually going deeper into the hole. And that's the way I describe what finally was happening with me. I felt like I was using a bunch of effort, but I was really just digging a hole deeper. And the only way it ended for me was to finally say, yes, I'll do what you want me to do, and I'll do it now.
Yes, sir. And a lot of us have had those experiences where God calls us at this age, but then we put it
Yes,
off or we run from it. But then, as you said, at some point, the Lord is going to be on you and on you and on you to where you can't, you have to submit to the gospel ministry. And so I think that's telling for a lot of us. That's part of our gospel ministry testimony is that we have tried whether to run away, we tried not to necessarily submit, but then God, at the end of the day, God always gets what he wants.
yes, I thought I was satisfying God. I played a little piano with my first cousin for the choir. I sang in the choir. And I wanted at that time that God would be, satisfied. I'm in church, I'm trying to serve. Maybe God would accept that. But of course, it became such that I just could not continue, except I finally did one Sunday. The benediction had been pronounced, but it was so heavy upon me that I stood up from the piano stool and asked for the attention. And the pastor who was at that time, the preacher, uh, gave recognition. I said, I have something to say. And I announced my call to the ministry the last Sunday of March, 1969. I could not hold it any longer. And I say to preachers, after all these years, when preachers are those who are contemplating being a preacher, I say to them, if there's any way that you can avoid being a preacher, then do it. Because I have in my mind that if God has really called you, you won't be able to tell God no. You'll have to say yes. But if you can tell God no, then to me, it's evidence that you haven't been genuinely called of God.
And so segue into that when you hear or you may be approached by somebody who says, I feel the Lord is calling me to the ministry. What are some ways that you evaluate that 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 statement in order to really see is this a genuine call or is this is just something that's emotional?
Well, of course, each individual will have to know for themselves, and that's one of the things that I emphasize. I emphasize that you may have persons who want to put ministry on you. They say they see it in you that you're going to be a preacher. They make prophetic statements about your future. But to me, the problem and concern is, do you personally really know? Do you have a personal conviction? When I'm talking with preachers consistently, I'll say to them that if you were in a very sound sleep, very sound in one of those wee hours of the morning sleep, and you were suddenly awakened and the question was put to you, has God called you to preach? You must be able to answer, I know that I'm called to preach without wavering, without doubting that. Um, you've got to know it personally. And so when I'm counseling persons in that area, I say, don't let your mother call you to preach. That's not a strong enough call. Don't let your friends put that on you or another preacher put it on you. You can be confirmed and they can share and help you to know that it's true. but you just can't get around the fact that you've got to know it for yourself.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's great advice. So what was your first sermon?
Oh, wow. Wow. First sermon. Now I haven't been anywhere to really study preaching. I've only seen preaching. I heard preaching growing up in a small church situation. And my first sermon, Easter Sunday night, second Sunday in April 1969, I'll never forget, was entitled God is Real. God is Real, based on Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And my conviction in that message probably was that about the 60s of last century, there was a controversy about persons talking about God is dead.
Mm.
And maybe that inspired and maybe that influenced me toward that first message that I wanted to say God is real. And I'll never forget. I don't know all what I said, but I do know I tried to hammer on the idea that God is real, and I know that He's real, and we have that kind of relationship, and evidence that God is real is just so overwhelming that I just could not doubt Him. So yes, I'll never forget my first sermon.
So after you started preaching, who were some of the influences that you had, and how were you growing in your preaching, and what type of advice did some of those who you looked up to give you throughout those early years of your preaching development?
Well, let me say that certainly my first influence of preaching was Reverend Dr. George V. Clark, who was actually my boyhood pastor at the Sweet Home Church in Round Rock before later he was called to the church in Mount Zion. He was my pastor, and I still consider him as my pastor. Um, Growing up in church, um, I was impressed with the man of God when he stood in the pulpit. Um, I guess the excitement of the man of God standing in the pulpit and the celebration that would climax the message. But then the question was asked, um, what did he preach? What did he say? We got caught up in the celebration and in the moment. But what did I have to carry away from that? And Dr. Clark came to be our pastor. And he was the first preacher that made impression upon me. I could really follow his sermons. I could move from one movement to the next in his development. It made a lot of sense to me. And many of those messages that he preached stayed with me, stayed with me. And so he was my first influence in preaching, along with other local preachers and pastors, especially in the Austin area. But one experience that really, took me to another level as far as what can happen in the pulpit was we got a little money together and went to the state convention, the Missionary Baptist General State Convention of Texas. And the guest preacher for the convention, in fact, I understand they rotated and shared interchange with each other. The state convention president was Dr. M.L. Price out of Houston, and the president of the BM&E convention was Dr. C.A.W. Clark. And Dr. C.A.W. Clark of Dallas was the guest preacher, and I heard Dr. C.A.W. Clark preach for the very first time, and I really was inspired and motivated because that little man preached about Bartimaeus receiving his sight And it just challenged me to say that I want to be able to preach. I'll never be able to preach like Dr. C.A.W. Clark, but to really work on it and develop preaching to that level. But when I come back to my foundation in preaching, I give that to Dr. Clark.
Yes, sir. And so, as you're developing in preaching, and as you're looking at preaching, as you're growing in preaching, how did you get called to your first assignment, your first church?
Okay. Okay, I'm a member of my home church, Sweet Home Baptist Church. And as I said, Reverend Clark is the pastor of the church. And I started preaching under him. He's my father in the ministry. Great, much influence upon my life, Dr. G.V. Clark. And he got called to the Mount Zion Church in Austin, and he accepted the call. This is in the beginning of 1970. 1970. And so therefore, Sweet Home Church was then a vacant church as church without pastor. And so they began the process of searching for the next pastor. I am 19 years of age at the time, and I'm not thinking about becoming a pastor. I didn't apply for, I didn't put in application to become pastor. And so they went through the process, and the chairman of deacons of the Sweet Home Baptist Church one day came to the house where we lived, the wife and I, and our young family, and said, would I consider becoming pastor? And so the way that it worked out, I certainly was not a stranger. I'd grown up in the Sweet Home Church, never been a member of any other church but that church. So what there was to know about me, they knew about me. And of course, family in the church is small town. But anyway, that was my first church. I got started in 1970. I got started in 1970 as my first opportunity. I had preached some, and so it was like 1 year from my calling to the ministry, to shortly after that first year, I became pastor of the church. I think Pastor G.V. Clark may have been aware of something, because he, during that year, gave me a lot of training experience. He gave me an opportunity to do things and took me by the hand, literally, and put me in some situations that prepared me for the pastorate in 1969 going into 1970.
So, first how were those first few years? This was your first pastorate. You said you're 19, married with a young family. How were those first few years of being a pastor and a husband and still in college? How was that experience?
Well, you would recognize I did have a full plate, but I had a wonderful people, the Sweet Home people, wonderful people who had patience with me. I thought it was amazing that I had grown up amongst them, and they had seen me grow up older than I was, but they accepted me as pastor. They accepted me as pastor, and I've looked back over my life. I've seen leadership positions that I was called to. So being a leader, not of a church, but leader of class, leader of groups, of organizations as a youth, it wasn't so strange to me. But part of it was that I was at a church that they didn't really reject. They believed that the pastor was the pastor of the church, and they allowed me to learn, make mistakes, to challenge them, accepted my preaching, my teaching, And it was really a good beginning for my pastoral journey because the people were kind.
Yes, sir. And so, as you say, you made mistakes. They let you, but they worked with you. They were patient with you. And I'm glad you said that. So, like when you were in those as a young pastor, what were some of the things that you may have struggled with or dealt with that you could give some insight to us young pastors about what to do and what not to do.
Well, as older preachers said to me, and an experience of my life, and I pass it down to other preachers, the young pastors especially, as it worked itself out, there's going to come a time in that relationship where you're going to be challenged to either be just the preacher in the pulpit or the pastor of the congregation. Some battle, some conflict is going to determine uh, who you're going to be. And I've had it at Sweet Home, I've had it at Antioch and Wichita Falls, I had it at True Vine in Tyler, Texas, had it at Mount Sinai in the early years. And it's going to be a time of faith challenge. Do you really believe God has planted you where you are, that you are God's man in that place where God has appointed you? And are you willing to trust God regardless of how it may challenge you? Are you going to be strong in the faith? Do you have conviction about what stand that you're taking, regardless of what might be the temporary consequences? And I believe God gave that to me. God gave that to me to be able to trust God and believe that God would sustain his man in his appointed position. It's going to take some stubborn faith sometimes. That do you really believe this is what God told you? Do you believe this is where God is leading you to lead the congregation? Um, One of the things of churches of that day and time was that they tried to support the church through programs, raising money, selling dinners, uh, fish fries, chicken dinners, uh, raffles, raffling off things that people would buy tickets for. And I said, no, that's not what God has shown me. God has shown me that we are to uh, give and support the church and the ministry from what God has given unto us. Tithes and offerings, tithes and offerings. And I challenged the church by saying that we're not going to sell dinners. We're not going to have raffles. We're not going to have programs just to say we're trying to raise money. And I actually did a little arithmetic, and I said that, even back then on minimum wage, that if persons would support and give the tithe, that the church could well be taken care of. I've always kind of had the conviction that the church ought not be begging sinners and people who don't come to church, begging them for monies to support the church. That I believe those who are members of the church, if we would do as God has laid it out, the church can not only survive, but it can thrive.
Absolutely.
So I didn't go in immediately, and I guess I should say that caution. I didn't go in immediately trying to change and do radical things. I didn't try to lead too fast because you got to bring the people along with you. And I believe preaching and teaching, especially what you want to happen in your local church, preach about it. What you want to be witness in your church, preach about it, and also be an example of it. So if I want the church to be a tithing church, I've got to preach tithing according to what's in the Word of God. And of course, personally, I've got to be a tither as an example of following in the teaching of the Lord where I want the church to follow me.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's very, very important. So, Sweet Home is your first church, and then you transition to Antioch in
Yes,
Wichita Falls, and also you transition to True Vine in Tyler. So, talk
yes.
talk to us about those transitions and those experiences.
Well, let me say that uh, I'm at the Sweet Home Church in Round Rock. It's a small town then. Round Rock has grown, so it's over 100,000 population and growing so fast. But back then in the 70s, Round Rock, when we lived there, barely had a population of 2,000. So it's very
Hmm.
small. And you would think that your future as a pastor would be to go to the city, Austin, an Austin church, a city church. And that was in my mind, in my thought at some time that I would graduate or be promoted to a city church. That never did happen. But a friend of mine who's deceased was preacher uh, John Hill Westbrook. John Hill Westbrook. He died, but he was a pastor of the Antioch Church in Houston. Well, this church in Wichita Falls had contacted him, seeking that he might become their pastor. He told them that he could not become their pastor, but he had a friend that he would recommend that they consider. That was me. And so from the uh, recommendation of John Hill Westbrook, I had never heard of even the city of Wichita Falls, much alone the Antioch Church. But on the basis of that, I was invited to come and preach. And subsequently, they did call me to be their pastor. And we packed up and we moved to Wichita Falls and left the Sweet Home Church after 8 years and became pastor at Antioch Church. As it turned out, that I did not remain at Antioch very long, as it were, because John Hill Westbrook, who was the pastor of the True Vine Church, I had shared with him, and he had left True Vine in Tyler when he was called to Antioch Church in Houston. And because of our relationship, and I'd preached there, I followed John Hill Westbrook to that very historic True Vine Baptist Church in Tyler, preached, and they called me and stayed there for over 7 years before it became time for me to return to my home area and come to the Mount Sinai Church.
So when you are going through these different churches, these transitions, if you will, because somebody may be wondering, how do you know when it's time to go, or how do you know when your season is up? How do you know that you've done what you can, but it's time to go, and you also have a family? So talk to us, Parmes, about that. Discerning when it's time for you to leave.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. I can't know for everyone, but within myself, my story was I'd been at Sweet Home Church for 8 years. Um, I had to rededicate myself to the pastorate at Sweet Home because there was a time that I was anxious to leave, feeling that I needed to be promoted and have a greater challenge. I wanted to go to a city church, but I was disappointed that the church that I thought might be an opportunity did not give me an opportunity to preach. And so that door was closed. And a friend preacher pointed toward a book that inspired him. And just the title of that book caused me to rededicate myself. And uh, the thing about that book was bloom where you are. Bloom where you are. The picture of a rose coming up in an unlikely setting or environment, but blooming in that situation. I took that back to Sweet Home and rededicated myself to it, to being the best pastor, giving the best that I could to leading God's people. And shortly after then, I had this invitation to go to the Antioch church. The opportunity, as I saw it, was that this is a larger church, more substantial as far as membership, facilities, had a church parsonage with the family we could live in. And it seemed like it was going to be a blessing to relocate. And I felt that it was time. I was comfortable that I had done what God would have me to do at the Sweet Home Church, and it was time. At the Antioch Church, it was a challenge, but I have a strong sense that the pastor is accountable for leadership and to lead the entire congregation. And so I'm a young man. At this time, I'm in my late 20s, and I'm going to a church that has history, but I am determined that I'm not just going to be the preacher. I intend to be the pastor. And one of the things was my first love was young people. And I learned that the young people at that church had at one time been disappointed because they'd been promised new robes, new choir robes. And the leadership at that time, they raised money for new robes, but then the money went in a different direction to their disappointment, and no robes were realized. And so I determined that we're going to give special monies toward this project. And I literally took it in my hands to secure that this money would go to new robes for the young people. And in a meeting, there was a challenge about the things that I'd done, because not only did we realize, I think maybe about $1,500 toward new robes for the young people, but I went to Dallas. I drove from Wichita Falls to Dallas to put in the order for the robes. And some felt that I had acted too independently, but I argued that I would not allow these young people to be disappointed another time. And so it was the hottest summer. This is in 1978. I don't think I'd ever witnessed temperatures of 114, 115 degrees before that we experienced in the summer of 1978. And the coldest winter. I'd never lived in a situation where for 2 solid weeks there was snow and ice on the ground in the winter of 1978 going into 1979. But it was an experience of growing. Reverend Dr. G.B. Clark, my home pastor, they were going to the National Convention, which was that year in Denver, Colorado. And I'd asked him to come and do the installation message for us. And so he did that. And actually, because of his popularity, the bus that was carrying some members of the association from Austin on their way to Denver, they actually stopped in Wichita Falls and were a part of that installation, supporting Reverend Clark preaching, supporting my installation. But I was disappointed that I'd grown up with churches doing what they could to help pastors. And I was told that all the expense of the installation was to be my personal expense. And I wasn't used to that. I had the idea that the church would take care of entertaining the preacher, providing meals and the like. I didn't know it was going to be that monies raised was going to have the expense deducted from that. And so it was a challenge. And then, like John Westbrook went to Houston, and I got a chance to go to True Vine, and I knew that it was time because it was a challenge. It was a strengthening thing of my ministry, but you get comfortable. God gives you a sense of peace, gives you a sense of peace with leaving. And so we left Wichita Falls and went to Tyler. And tell you the truth, the Mount Sinai Church became without a pastor, and I was contacted. But I said it was not time. I had not the feeling. God had not given me release. And so when Mount Sinai became vacant a second time, it was that God gave me a level of comfort to return. And so I think every preacher has to have a comfort level in his heart and in his thinking that it is time for relocating to answer another call. And that happened with me, to leave True Vine, because I wanted to be moving forward. I didn't want to settle upon the past history, and I wanted to challenge that church, and actually talked about building a new building, and it was resisted because some were saying the cost was too great. And when they were saying that the cost was too great to go into a building program, it was also a message to me. It was time for me to think, to answer the call to Mount Sinai, which timing wise I became comfortable with. Even though I was association moderator, had a position in the state convention through the Congress, but I felt that it was time, and so we came to Mount Sinai.
And wow, that's definitely eye opening and a lesson. And then you said first time to Mount Sinai, you didn't feel comfortable, but finally you felt comfortable. So when you get to Mount Sinai, is this 1986?
1986, yes.
So how were those first few years in Mount Sinai, and now I believe this would be what 36 years this year that you've been at
Yeah,
Mount
coming
Sinai.
up on the 36th year. We've served 35, working on 36, yes.
And so when you have been at Mount Sinai for as many years as you've been, and for those who don't know, Mount Sinai is a wonderful church. It's a beautiful church. They built. So just talk to us about the time from start to Mount Sinai to the present.
Interesting question. There were some persons looking from the outside who questioned, why would I leave a substantial church, the True Vine Baptist Church in East Texas, True Vine, where I was moderator, where I was moving up, had a strong future ahead of me, um, to come to a church that probably had fewer than 100 active members, a small church frame building um, that had for uh, the years of its existence never been a large church, would be a church that when you think of Austin churches, you would not have thought of Mount Sinai, faithful church, loving church, close knit church, but small church. I believe the sanctuary might have been able to hold 100 people plus crowded in there, but the Lord had shown me the area, Austin. I grew up in Round Rock and so was familiar with Austin, and had witnessed across the years the tremendous growth in the Austin area. And the question is, all these new people coming into Austin, where are they going to church? Where are they being ministered? And the Lord pictured it for me in the vision as a field that was white unto harvest. And I felt that even though Mount Sinai was small at the time, it had potential. a good spirit was in the church. I was impressed with the activity of the men and the faithfulness, and that the church was not the kind of church that would fight a pastor. And so, believing God's vision, we came to Mount Sinai, and we came by faith. We came trusting. We came that the people would do for us as God led them to do, by faith and by love. And so the basic things they began to do for us, stretching, because before that time, Mount Sinai had not had a full-time ministry. When I say full-time, I'm talking about a pastor who was not supported by a secular job, as I had been early in my pastoral ministry. But they accepted the challenge, the kind of things that I felt would be needful for a church. They accepted that. Fellowship was there, faith was there, warmth and friendliness was there, and the Lord caused us to grow. In fact, we broke all kind of, I'm sure, fire marshals regulations about occupants of the building. We had procedures everywhere on top of each other, scattering out into the vestibule, and we just had to relocate. And so after 3 years, I believe, at that church, we purchased a Church of Christ building that the Church of Christ congregation was disbanding. And that was our first move from 22nd Street to 38th and a half Street. And one of the things that excited me about moving to the next location, 1989, was that this church had classrooms, and that excited me because I believe the teaching ministry could be improved with spaces where persons could have separated classrooms, because I've always felt that our teaching ministry needs to be challenged, to be improved, and to grow. And so the 10 classroom spaces around this building excited me. We moved into that facility 1989, I believe, and stayed there 5 years. We still experienced great growth, and it was at that location, which is actually on 38th and a half Street in Austin, East 38th and a half Street. The first church was on 22nd Street. This church was on 38th and a half Street. And it was at that time and at that church that we started our second service. We added to the 11 o'clock hour schedule an early service at 7:45. So we're still growing, and we accepted the challenge of having two services, but we're still growing, and we're looking for other opportunities. And then another congregation, Anglo congregation on Cameron Road, wanted to relocate and wanted to sell their property. And so we relocated after negotiating with them. In 1994, we went to our first address on Cameron Road in Austin. Something exciting, well, I say exciting, something about the testimony of our going to the church on Cameron Road was that the church had some division about whether they would sell it or not. Some wanted to sell it. Others wanted not to sell it. And they actually ended up in the courtroom over whether to sell the property or not. And as it turned out, there was a group that was leading the opposition that was had a spokesperson that said that this church would only be sold over his dead body. And as it turned out, that I was at the national convention, someone called and said, Pastor, you know that man who said the church wouldn't only be sold over his dead body? And they telephoned me and said, that man is dead. And they buried him. And that cleared the way for the sale, opened the door. It gave us a testimony that you don't get in the way of what God would have done. And we were able to go into that building with testimony, and God continued to grow Mount Sinai.
Wow.
And then in 2018, we moved to our present location a little further north, still on Cameron Road. But they've been a people that I said to the church, I believe a church ought to have faith. I believe a church ought to follow leadership. I believe a church ought to love each other. And I believe a church ought to obey God's word as best it can. And we've been trying to sow that seed into the church, and whatever we've felt led that the Lord wanted to happen, I preached about it. Series of sermons.
My. That's wow. That all of that is such an encouragement and a testimony for us to hear about, visionary, about planting those seeds, about, you don't get in the way of God, because God is clearly doing some great things. And if you haven't seen Mount Sinai, the current location, it's a beautiful facility that the Lord has blessed Mount Sinai to acquire and to still be ministry in Austin, Texas. So, Father, I won't keep you that much longer, but talk to us about preaching. Talk to us about your preaching style, or your just preparation in preaching.
Well, my thought about the ministry is it helps to have training, school if it were possible. My inspiration back in 1973, I felt that I did not have sufficient teaching and training as far as a preacher pastor. And so I enrolled in Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth, actually relocated the family while I was still at Sweet Home, commuting on the weekends. But I wanted to get that degree and be exposed to sharpening my tools and be exposed to a level of training that I had not had at that time before. But when it comes to preaching, Mount Sinai knows, and preachers that I've tried to share with, I am a stickler for preaching the word, preaching the text, digging at the text, more about what is this passage saying, analyzing the text, looking at the text as a whole, and then looking at the text in parts. I believe my English background as a subject comes in helpful, for it helps me to see what would be the major points and the supporting points. And I thank God for all that is available to help a preacher look at a text, doing his work. And I'm not just talking about readily going to commentaries or sermon books, but I'm talking about actually looking at the text, and that a person doesn't have to have as much language skill with so much help out there that available right now through books and computer programs. You can really dig into the Word of God, and that's what I try to do. I try to stay with what is this text preaching, and I'm very disappointed when I hear or listen to a preacher announcing a wonderful text and then going away from that text to say a whole lot of things that are not related to the text that has been announced. I'm a stickler for that. The power is in lifting up the text rather than made up stories or things that might be popular gimmicks.
Mm.
And so that's what I strive to do. I strive to be a student of the Word of God. What is it saying? What does it mean? And what is the application of it?
Wow. And so then, as you look at preaching now, compared to preaching that you've experienced and witnessed, what encourages you, what encourages you, what discourages you, and uh, do you see this generation of preaching and preachers having the same type of zeal and the same work habits as you were just talking about?
Well, good news and bad news. Good news and bad news. I see a lot of young preachers. I say are gifted and talented, and I'm thankful for them and blessed through their preaching ministry, their teaching ministry. Bad news. I see a lot of copycat imitation of some believing that their success is to be like a popular preacher, to be so much like that preacher that you can readily see that they're trying to imitate what they think is a successful minister's pulpit, not just his words, but mannerisms and the like. Um, I would much rather that person give me something that's meaty. Give me something that will last longer than my walking out the door. Give me something to live by and to face the challenges of life. That I think that there are those who have the zeal, who really want, and I'm thankful for those, but I'm also disappointed that some gimmickry is also becoming popular because some people think that's crowd pleasing. And if you're crowd pleasing, you get invitations and you get on platforms because of that. But I think preaching is something that we've got to take so serious that nobody wants to play with it, but wants to deliver the word as God has written it and as God has given it to us, because that to me is what will bless the people.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Well, that definitely appreciate that as well. And then talk to us on building your preacher library and aiding in your preaching when it comes to books, building that library to really grow yourself and grow your mind and grow your spirit.
Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. I believe that circumstances prevent a lot of times preachers from formal education, can't go to school, too far away. The door is not open for them. But I believe books are available and accessible, that I encourage preachers to be readers, be students, spend time reading first of all the Bible, reading the Bible, steady diet of reading God's word. You've read it before, go back and read it again, reading God's word, and then get you some good tools. The first Bible study tools that were gifted to me was Dr. Clark gave me a study Bible. I still have it today. So much help is in having that study Bible, so much information available in the study Bible, and then begin to look at the kind of helps that will help you get into the Word of God, uh, word studies, histories, uh, reading some of the great preachers, their autobiographies, as well as some of their sermon material. Um, it's regrettable, I think, in some ways, that through the social media, uh, people are putting out clips of sermons that are very popular. And a lot of them, thousands of persons have tuned into those clips, but they haven't tuned into the entire message. They've only celebrated the close and the, great celebration. But what was laid down um, to lead up to that? I try to be disciplined and not just hear what has been said at the end. I want to hear what is said leading up to that, how it was built up. So before this computer age, I'm older, and the computers and what's offering on computer programs and Bible helps program didn't exist back then. And so when I would travel away from home, at least one of my suitcases were going to be full of books because I'm going to be reading and studying. But you don't have to do that these days. But I've invested a lot in having books. Something about my earliest beginnings was that I love to read, and I love to take advantage of reading. And you can get, if not a formal education, you can get a good workable understanding if every preacher is a reader. So I say to young preachers, be about reading, helpful reading, sound reading. It'll bless your ministry.
Yes, sir. And then talk to us for your experience. How has it been pastoring through this pandemic?
It's been that we've learned some new things. We've learned some new things, had to learn some new things and new methods. Still preaching the same gospel, but uh, it's different, especially when it was getting to the point where they were shutting down in 2020. I always remember that we just had an annual service in March of 2020, the second Sunday, and that the third Sunday, the next Sunday, uh, they were emphasizing that you're not to gather in any large numbers. And so we had to learn how to preach, and not so much seeing people, but seeing pews, and to focus on imagining that you're standing in front of people. Preaching without the physical presence was something that we had to learn to do, and learning this new technology of how to live stream and to record messages is all new stuff. And I think that it has challenged us to make a little tighter in that sense. Um, when you have an audience that is live streamed, maybe everything that you had time to do and to do in a sermon, a message, you have to get a little straightforward with it. I believe we're learning, and we're still learning. Well, we're into the third year in this pandemic. Things that we took for granted, such as full choirs and full pews before you to encourage you, that you could focus on, that you've had to learn how to develop that and recognize that you are before people that you don't see, but you get perhaps feedback to let you know and remain conscious that someone's out there. And I was encouraged to know that I'm preaching at Mount Sinai Church, and here's a lady who wrote to us from Amarillo, Texas, who had picked up the broadcast and had encouraged us with her words. So this pandemic, want to be safe, encourage those that are returning, that we want all of us to protect ourselves. And because they're wearing the mask, you don't have, as we're used to, that vocal feeding back that we're so used to. But we're learning. It things that I've been forced to do that I didn't think we were ready to do, but we had to do them anyway because of the times we're in.
And so, and it seems like God will always do something to where you have no choice but to transition.
Exactly right. You've got to adapt to what is. Not the way you want it to be, but it's what's before you, and go forward and do the very best that you can. And I thank you that the time that you invited us, I see you doing that at your church to deal with what is and to be faithful to continue in spite of maybe those who are not there, but trusting God that the word is getting out. I observed the time that I was there with you, you doing that. And that's what we all have to do with that kind of consciousness.
Yes, sir. And yes, Pop Made was so kind to come down to Oklahoma and preach for us and did a fantastic job. Talked about that woman with the issue of blood, just magnificent job. So once again, I appreciate you for coming, and I mean it was awesome. It was awesome. So is there anything else that's on your heart you want to express? Anything else you want to say? Anything else that you just want to inform us about? The floor is yours.
Well, I guess if there's anything that I thought that I wanted to say, especially to an audience of preachers, is give God your very best. Always give God your very best. Uh, do not look down upon any opportunity that you have because you never know what impact that you may make in that effort. Um, do it from the heart. Do it because you love to do it. Do it because you want to be obedient and be patient. Things may not happen or change instantly, but keep at it. Keep at it. Don't surrender, but press on. And I'm saying from my experience, I had to learn bloom where you are. Do the very best you can in your situation, and that God knows where you are. And when it is in God's will, God will do something for you even beyond your expectations.
Yes, sir. Definitely appreciate that. And also, Padme, tell people about Mount Sinai. Tell those who are listening who may want to come visit you, and also tell them about your church.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Certainly want to say to all that you're welcome. The Mount Sinai Church is located in Austin, physical address 8500 Cameron Road, Austin, Texas, zip code 78754. You can find us on the World Wide Web at www.themount.net. You can email to us, Pastor Mays, Pastor A.W. Mays at themount.net. Right now, we're doing in-person worship at 11 o'clock on Sundays. We do temperature screenings. We wear our facial mask and coverings, hand washing. We're still physically distancing. We have in-person worship at 11 o'clock and in-person worship opportunities Wednesday evenings at 7 p.m. We do have some classes returning to campus for church school at 9:45. You're certainly welcome anytime to come and be with us at the Mount, where we love to worship and to praise God. Thank you so very much for that opportunity. You're welcome.
Absolutely. Well, I want you to stay on for a couple of quick minutes, and then, but I want everyone who is watching to like, comment, and share. Once again, thank you for tuning in, and you can join anytime we need to. You can definitely go to the Mount Sinai Missionary Baptist Church in Austin, Texas, and thank God for Pop Mays, Reverend Dr. A.W.A. Mays, for his insight and his wisdom. And like I said, he is one of God's greatest preachers. And I'm just grateful that he has been so kind to me over the years, and I thank him so much.
Well, I'm very thankful that God has granted me great grace in your eyes, that I appreciate the support that you've been and that you continue to give to us. Thank you so very much. I'm encouraged.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. God bless you.